Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Jim Cardoso, Senior Director for GNSI and your host for At the Boundary. Today on the podcast, I'll be talking to Dr. Jacob Holzer, a psychiatrist on staff at Harvard Medical School and a non-resident senior fellow here at GNSI. He's also the mastermind behind our next GNSI Policy Dialogues, which come out later this week on our YouTube channel. A few months ago, Jake came to us with a fascinating idea: to examine national security through the lens of human behavior and mental health. This approach fits squarely into why we created the GNSI Policy Dialogues, to explore topics that aren't traditionally associated with national security. Previously, our policy dialogues have explored topics like transnational repression and the weaponization of hunger during conflict. Along those lines, this Wednesday we'll add the next policy dialogues: behavioral and mental health aspects of national security, the invisible front lines. The discussion will debut on our YouTube channel on June 24th at 1 p.m. Eastern, featuring experts from psychiatry, behavioral health, and threat assessment. After a stint in Air Force intelligence operations, Jake attended medical school and has had a distinguished career, currently serving as a physician in clinical and forensic psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He'll be joined in that discussion by Dr. Ryan Wagoner, the chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurosciences here at the University of South Florida, as well as former FBI behavioral profiler Mond Mugiya, who's now the director of a DC-based risk advisory consulting agency called Control Risks. I asked Jake if he'd be able to give us a preview of this week's discussion, and he was happy to oblige today on At the Boundary. Dr. Jake Holzer, welcome to At the Boundary. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity to, be included in this.
I look forward to it. So first of all, behavioral, mental health aspects of national security, I won't call them uncovered, but they're certainly undercovered as compared to fairly typical, topics of national security conversations. How did you gravitate to this field of study?
Yeah, so, thanks for asking about that. Probably in a really kind of checkered way. But, just in background, I started out many years ago in the Air Force, and my area was totally different. This was before medical training. I was actually in intelligence operations, but had a really positive experience back then. It was sort of afterwards that I came to follow more of a clinical training and career, and got involved in, ultimately psychiatry, and sort of through training, over the years have done both clinical and forensic psychiatry. But I've always had an interest in areas of like political, politics, political science, international relations. And essentially in forensic psychiatry, I've done court work, evaluations in that. But many years ago, I developed more of an academic interest, so around doing some research in the relationship of clinical forensic psych and national security. So that was more my own personal interest that evolved into this academic area. And, I sort of noticed in reviewing the literature, what's out there already, not a lot of people do this work. There's sort of a handful of people that have done research and published. There are people who work within the public sector and the government consulting with agencies, with intelligence, the intelligence community, military, law enforcement. So I've had an interest in this, and I'm taking it more from the academic viewpoint.
Well, I think that, We did the recent recording for the policy dialogues, and we're going to kind of use that as a baseline for our conversation today. And we'll release that on the 24th of June, as we talked about, as I talked about in the intro. And really, like I said, it's a conversation we haven't had that often, so I really look forward to continuing that and kind of giving a little bit of a teaser trailer, as you were, for the actual policy dialogues conversation that you recorded recently. But with that, let's start big picture. So the video, it's going to be released on the 24th. It's got 3 mega themes: the susceptibility to terrorism, stalking, and then the lover-hater framework of extremism. Now, your professional focus is on susceptibility to terrorism, so let's briefly touch on the last 2 first, and then we'll get to that at the end. So stalking is discussed in the video by USF's own Dr. Ryan Wagoner, a colleague of yours. It's by no means a new phenomenon, but the application of stalking to public officials, where this becomes a national security issue, it is. What are some of the goals and mindsets that you see behind stalking a public figure, somebody that the stalker probably has never met?
Right. Well, my view is, and I think Ryan did a fabulous job in reviewing this topic. My view is it's really a vital area to really understand, what the threats are. It does have a clear national security component to it. The complexity is, it's pretty varied. So, and I think Ryan really touched on all of this, that, stalking primarily will involve more of a, sort of lower level, person to person kind of aspect where, someone may stalk a friend, family member, someone who, there's some personal connection with, that has really not much to do with public figures. But it could be someone in an occupation or something, and then there could be like a number of reasons for that. So much of that we never hear about. That's more at a lower level, personal type level. But there are examples where stalking can evolve into the public sector and present as a threat against officials. And it's really important to really look at that to try and understand that phenomenon. What I got out of that talk, what Ryan presented, was just how complex it really is. It can involve different reasons, that may motivate somebody to stalk, including sort of animosity and threat of violence. But who knows? It could be because of, the person being famous, and the stalker just wants to make some personal connection with that person, as in, maybe a Hollywood star. So you don't really know the motivation, but it's important to really understand that that's one variable to really look at. That mental illness, psychiatric conditions may play a role in some of these and may help in understanding, what is going on there. The stalker's intent may be pretty benign. Again, they may want to, let's say, make a personal connection with a star, but in reality, they may present a real threat of violence. And, the last thing that person needs, the potential victim, is to have some stranger, kind of stalking them and presenting this threat. So I don't know if that answered the question directly.
Yeah, no, it did actually. It's a good, It's a good overview of the concept of stalking. I think it's interesting how you say the intentions may be benign, but the activities may not seem benign to the stalkee. And that is becoming more, it's becoming more ubiquitous these days. And we're seeing more, activities in that. And it is affecting public figures, which could then impact national security. I mean, another aspect of that, you at GNSI, we try to talk about things at what we call the boundary of policy and technology. And technology has impacted stalking. Stalking has existed for centuries, probably, but digital stalking has really changed quite a bit. Is there any? And a lot of the things we talk about in this area, there's a technology aspect to it. Is there any trends or areas that you see as concerning when you talk about the digital stalking and social media presence and greater social connectivity?
Yeah. So Jim, that's a really critical area. Stalking may be a small part of that's important to really understand, but there's a much broader, sort of component to the use of social media in a number of different topics that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And I can get into that. Stalking on the, on social media is a real growing problem. So, one population this affects, could be like adolescents, teenagers who are bullied online. And they could be stalked. They may not want to be. People who, I'm sort of focusing on teenagers, let's say, but that's not exclusively, the only group, but, sort of people who use social media, they don't have full control over who can access that. And there can be like malintent. You can get let's say in the case of like adolescents, teenagers, where you could have a classmate who has some ill intent and they're going after somebody online. But, it probably happens fairly frequently with people who attempt to do, like, let's say, financial scams online, or are fixated on someone for some other reason, and that can be a real problem, a real threat.
Yeah. I think that, everybody, even a lot of national security personalities have a fairly robust social media presence. Now, there's controls obviously on how much they can be stalked, but there's still opportunities, I think, for harassment and for impact as well. It's one of those things that it just hasn't been a factor for centuries or for decades, but now in the recent past, it's becoming more and more so. So it's affecting, and I think also a generation's being raised that just lives in this arena of constant social media presence. So these are the national security leaders of tomorrow. And so how they approach it could be different as well.
Right. It's a fairly new phenomenon. So there isn't, I think it's still at a period of time where these sort of things are happening, and there aren't a lot of brakes on it yet. A lot of like interventions to really secure and safeguard against it. There are some, but trying to think of examples of this where there's the ability to kind of break into sites with malware and sort of manipulate information. And I think the whole arena of AI and developing AI throws yet another variable into this. This comes up, sort of a really good example. Again, this isn't quite stalking behavior, in the traditional sense, but it's all part of the same context, where this has come up as an issue around campaigning. And it can be, political campaigning at like a local or state or even national level, where somebody may introduce AI into the campaigning and it can throw things totally off. Some AI is very realistic. So, yeah, again, it sort of speaks to the complexity of this issue. But, it's not out of the realm that somebody out there could have some malintent against a public official, and with the use of AI and, good social media skills, really develop a really high risk situation.
Well, it kind of, it links to what you talked about in the policy dialogues and some of those susceptibilities to terrorism, some of those mental traits, I guess, character traits could be aligned with, with stalkers as well as some, violent extremism and some of the things you'll talk about. So let's turn to that. So, you noted several areas of recent neurobiological research to help determine why people gravitate to extremism and radicalization. And listening to the policy dialogues that'll be released soon, there's a key theme that I saw a couple times, which is sacred values versus non-sacred values. Could you explain the difference between those two and how that impacts how one might be drawn into violent actions?
Sure. Yeah. So really, fascinating research that was done, kind of a handful of studies.
And we're going to get to some of those a little more in depth too. I got some follow-ons to that too. So yeah.
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm happy to get into this. But it's really interesting. So, one area that, and again, a lot of this stuff is interconnected, but that whole area of extremism and radicalization, and we're sort of not talking about, so I want to clarify that I'm not talking about any specific, let's say, ideology or political persuasion. I want to almost leave all that stuff aside. What I'm sort of talking about are people who are, more extremist in thinking compared with people who are like more moderate or centrist in thinking. And, there's been a handful of studies looking at this in some different areas. A lot of it is done in European settings. But one of the studies really looked at, as you were describing, looked at this concept of sacred values. And researchers in Spain studied that in a very small subgroup of young men in the Muslim population there. And they looked at a young cohort of people who were willing to fight and die for a sacred cause. And so sacred causes have to do more with spiritual beliefs in God and religion, as opposed to materialistic money, right? So one of the research studies, they did some imaging and this, sort of there's a lot of technical aspects, but they did brain imaging. And they basically, what they did was they took this small group of people who were willing to fight and die for a sacred cause. And they basically scanned them. They did a brain scan. And then they introduced this game called Cyberball. And I'm not really quite familiar with, so I've read about it. I've never played it. but cyberball is this online game, and it basically elicits strong feelings of either being included or excluded. And so what this research showed was that everybody in this small group who wanted to fight and die for a sacred cause, their brain lit up in a certain area in the front side, the frontal area of the brain. And the frontal area, frontal and prefrontal cortex of the brain, has to do with higher order functions that deal with social interactions, social integration, inclusion in a group, decision making. So a lot of higher order functions. And, again, getting back to that group, some people were included in this cyberball game, and their brains lit up when they wanted to fight and die for a sacred cause, but not for money. If they were offered money, the brain did not light up.
Mm-hmm.
People who were excluded in the cyberball game, their brains lit up both for sacred causes and for money. Really fascinating if you think about this, that, it had some real world meaning that people who are socially included in a group, supported, included in some group. I'm not talking about a terrorist group. I'm talking about a social group. If they're felt included and integrated in a group, they seem to be better protected from being vulnerable to, committing violence for money.
Yeah.
Who were excluded, who were isolated, excluded socially, could be bought, paid to commit violence. Really an important piece of research, from my point of view.
Yeah, the inclusion versus exclusion. That's another one of those that is, it seems to flow through that study. And I think you discuss it a couple times as well, that, and look, we've, you hear about people being, they were a lone wolf, and really they didn't seem to have much, they didn't socialize much, they didn't have many friends. It is something we've seen kind of historically, sometimes in stories that rise about people after the fact that have committed some type of violence or extremist act.
Right. That's actually very true. So, here we're talking about people in the study who never actually committed violence. This is just stuff they were thinking of, they talked about, and it showed some real brain changes.
Yeah.
But practically, there's unfortunately hundreds of cases of individuals who have committed mass violence, one way or the other, kind of linked to some belief or ideology. And you're exactly right that, we can look at traits and patterns, and that many of those people, and that's part of what I've been interested in, that many of those people have had some social disconnection, some sort of level of isolation. Social media plays a major role where, they don't have healthy social outlets, but they spend a lot of time on social media, communicating with other people in chat rooms. And that there's sort of a number of other issues that have to do with, vulnerabilities, clinical issues, that are part of the mix. But you're right. Some of this we can see, it's a vulnerability in that group.
Well, and, that's, a lot. It's interesting because you talk about social media and, talk about social engagement, inclusion versus exclusion. Sometimes the engagement, if it's over social media, I think we've seen or at least heard of areas that could be almost harmful in some ways, because we talked about this, offline, but it kind of is driving, and you talk about on the Policy Dialogues video as well, that sort of there's everything's black and white right now. I mean, everybody's kind of lining up on their sides. And you said earlier in this podcast, it's not aligned with a certain political belief or a certain, it's just more aligned with just an extremism, whether it's on one side of the spectrum or the other. And it seems that social media can almost exacerbate that because you don't have a conversation. You don't get conflicting views. You just get something that feeds what you already believe. And it can, I guess you can, for lack of a term, kind of spiral and not really benefit from what true social interaction could be.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. I mean, part of it is, again, you're taking like an individual who already may have some vulnerability, right? They're open to some persuasion, suggestion. They're susceptible to that. And then, in social media, there's a lot of anonymity.
Yep.
I'm pronouncing that correct. Anonymity. But they don't know who they're talking with. And in that sort of setting, things can spiral out of control where, there's people who are encouraging someone to become violent. Come on, you can do it. We need you to live up to being a man. Show us that you can do it. Where 99% of the people in the chat room, let's say a chat room has hundreds of people, 99% of them would never commit violence. They're okay at talking the talk, right? But it only takes one vulnerable individual who is susceptible to this stuff. And it could be one of the things that crystallizes in that person to then say, I've got to take matters in my own hands and go on to commit some mass violent offense.
Yeah. Yeah. Another study that you talk about, it's a Cambridge study, and it was trying to encapsulate the personality traits of someone potentially prone to gravitating towards extremism. And now one thing, as I was listening, and help me out here, because I noticed there's an apparent dichotomy. Because you talk about a caution in decision-making and seeking accuracy over speed, as opposed to the tendency to act impulsively once they process the information. Could you walk me and the audience through that relationship and any other notable traits as well with that Cambridge study?
Yeah. So that Cambridge study, that was pretty interesting because they stressed there that they looked at, again, not a specific political ideology or persuasion. They looked at people who were more inclined to like the extreme point of view versus moderate, centrist. And they had a number of findings, including kind of a lack of cognitive flexibility, being sort of more rigid, this thing called dogmatic. They talked about that as one of the traits. And that they had this one study where they did this timed exercise. So everybody knew it was timed. You only had a certain amount of time, and then you would fail if you go over time. And the people who were more extremist disregarded that time frame, and they focused on getting things exactly right. But they ran out of time and they failed. Whereas the people who were more moderate kind of made mistakes, but they wanted to get done before the time limit. So that was that time test where they wanted, the extremists wanted to be more perfect. But in general, they tend to be more risk-taking, impulsive. Now, it gets tricky. This area that I'm talking about, and I think, it's important maybe to touch on this, that it really is complicated. There's a number of other factors you want to think about with this, because there's certain professions. So let's say, in people who are not, I'm not talking about extremists ideologically,
mm-hmm.
but there's certain professions where you want people to be a little bit more of a risk taker, because if they're not, then they could that could inhibit their functioning.
Yeah.
We see this potentially, like first responders,
Mm-hmm.
that, by nature, they're going to have a higher risk tolerance, but, that doesn't mean they're extremists.
No.
So there's more to this conversation. There's more complexity to this. I think the other interesting thing, and I was thinking about this, is that it also depends a little bit on the environment when we talk about extremism versus moderation. And when I was trying to process all this stuff with reading these studies, that, it really depends on the environment and the definitions of extremism, because I started to think a good example would be, this really sad case of Alexei Navalny, who was, sort of really active in running for a democratic stand in Russia until, he was apprehended and jailed,
Mm-hmm.
and then eventually died in prison. But, in the U.S., he would be considered a real moderate in thinking, progressive moderate. In Russia, he was considered an extremist.
Yeah.
So again, I'm sort of talking about this because you want to factor in kind of what the environment is, that it isn't just black and white. There's sort of a number of variables, and that, a person may still be extremist, even though they're defined as something different because of that environment.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And actually it leads to, a follow-on in that it goes to, terrorist profiling. And it has historically been focused almost singularly on clinical and psychological, socio-demographic factors. And kind of what you talk about, it articulates that those singular factors are not useful. It needs to be a more integrative approach. And that's something you talk about in the policy dialogue, and why it needs to be a more integrative approach, so that, a first responder isn't, seen as an extremist. It's just there's certain personality traits, but you have to step back and look at it more integrated across various factors. Can you expand a bit on what this integrated approach, what that entails and why that's so important?
Sure. Yeah. So in the panel discussion, I did talk about a paper that there was this review article. I don't have the details of who wrote that, but it was sort of an interesting paper where they stressed that if you look at any of these individual not variables, but frameworks like social psychology or clinical aspects, or more of a taking it from a political viewpoint, that you're really missing the boat on this, and that really to try and grasp this phenomenon, understand it a little bit better, you really need to factor in a number of different areas and think about this. And so, in that paper, they talk about things like factoring in social psychology and cognitive psychology, sort of neurobiology, but then also factoring in, things like the political environment. There's the concept of like rhetoric that may be going on politically, how that factors in. Again, the use of social media, how that may factor into this picture. And I think there's a concept, that has been described in the area of lone actor terrorism, where, you want to look at a number of different variables. So we sort of talked about a little bit, vulnerabilities. There may be clinical aspects, there's personality aspects, the sort of political environment and rhetoric, use of social media, weapons access. Do they have, someone may have the motivation and have little ability to carry something out, but you want to look at that aspect of it, their capacity to engage in violence. And what you need to do is really look at all of these things and how they come together and crystallize in an individual where they then would be at higher risk. If you look at one of those things like social media alone, that doesn't really give you enough information.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's the integrative thing.
I would think that'd be challenging, though, to be able to, do that successfully. You've got to have a interdisciplinary approach and a wide variety of expertise to be able to do that evaluation, which I would imagine would be hard to come by.
So, yeah, it's much easier said than done. So, people can look at this academically, as far as research goes. That's one thing. But I think the challenge is really more practically for people who may potentially be at higher risk of committing violence. And the challenge for law enforcement to be able to kind of tease through this and identify people who may present as a higher risk, proactively. That's the real challenge.
Well, and the Policy Dialogue is another guest that talks is Mond Mugiya, former FBI profiler, and that's kind of his world. How do law enforcement, how do the folks that can prevent these sort of things, how do they do this integrated interdisciplinary approach and be able to hopefully identify risk factors or risk human beings that are out there before they take some type of action? It seems it's obviously challenging because people are still doing it. There's still extremist acts happening that are sometimes completely unexpected. You talk about the CEO of the healthcare. That was just out of the blue. And I think that really opened up a lot of people's eyes onto the possibilities that could exist out there in ways we approach who's out there.
Yeah. No, it's, I can appreciate it's enormously challenging. Mond, who was on the panel, the, person who did that work with the behavioral analysis program, he talked about that, the work really involves a collaborative effort, I think, between law enforcement. It could be also mental health professionals and potentially other professionals who would work as a team in trying to identify people who may be at higher risk and potentially do something, and it may be, getting someone help one way or the other proactively to really try to reduce that risk. But, I think it must be enormously difficult. And you think about it, and I had these discussions, in working with Mond and some other people just around the research part of it and the writing, where, they would talk about how, on social media, let's say in some platform, you may get, 10,000 people who talk about the need for violence to change something, right? 10,000 people talk about it. And, again, 99% of them talk about it and they stop, get off social media, and that's the end of it, right? And how do you identify? That's sort of an enormous number of false positives. And, there's also the issue of, they have the right to talk about it. you can't prevent them from talking about it, but you also want to be able to identify who in that group could go on to present more than just talking about it, but an actual threat. And I'm not sure how exactly that's done, out there on social media. I mean, without violating like the First Amendment. I mean, how do you control for that?
And that's why we have conversations like this to kind of just kind of walk through that and give people, not that we have all the answers, but give people something to think about. And maybe they listen to this and they'll listen to and watch the policy dialogues that will release on June 24th, and they'll have an opportunity to think more about that. We are getting ready to wrap up this podcast, though. So one last question: what other areas are you researching and pursuing that kind of hit that Venn diagram, for lack of a better term, between behavioral mental health and national security? Right.
No, great question. So this is really an area I'm really very interested in, and there's sort of a number of groups. We actually are working on a new project, a new book that's going to come out, really looking at this more closely. But there's sort of a number of high threat groups that sort of touch on this area of national security risk. One area that I'm interested in is the group that deals, that presents a risk of like committing treason and espionage, violating the Espionage Act. There's another category that are individuals that present sort of an insider threat. They may be within an organization, and they may present as a threat financially or through violence to that organization. It sort of turns out, really interestingly, that these are all disparate groups, right? A group, the treason espionage group, lone actor terrorism group, insider threat group, but there's overlap between these groups. They all have some common features. And so it's really looking at that. Some of those common features are really clinically based, that have to do with personality traits, some of their clinical histories. There may be some variables that sort of stand out. So, those are areas that I'm really interested in.
Well, we may have some opportunity in the future to explore them a little bit more, and I look forward to that. But for today, Dr. Jacob Holzer, I really want to thank you for your time today. Really appreciate your insights.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks again for the opportunity to do this.
Special thanks to our guest today, Dr. Jacob Holzer, for taking some time to give us a preview of this week's Policy Dialogues event titled Behavioral and Mental Health Aspects of National Security, The Invisible Front Lines. That debuts on our YouTube channel on June 24th. Next week on the podcast, we'll be joined by GNSI Research Fellow Dr. Guido Rossi. He recently wrote a decision brief, available on our website, on the joint British-American military base on Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. This key strategic island is currently part of the British Indian Ocean Territory. However, the United Kingdom is considering a return of sovereignty back to Mauritius. It's a complex geopolitical situation, and Guido is going to talk us through it. If you don't want to miss that episode or any other episode, be sure to like and subscribe to At the Boundary on your favorite podcast platform. And we thank you for sharing some time with us today. You can find GNSI on YouTube, LinkedIn, and X. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Tell your friends and colleagues as well. And be sure to sign up for our monthly newsletter. You can find all this on our website, usf.edu/GNSI. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we've found to be insightful, intriguing, maybe controversial, but overall, just worth talking about. I'm Jim Cardoso, and we'll see you at the Boundary.